You're watching City Channel 4, your window to our community.
The goal of the Geneva Lecture Series is to offer a Christian perspective on life, culture, and the issues of the day to the community. Our format tonight is that first we will have our lecture, then we'll have a little time to fill out the questionnaire that has been given you. There'll be time for question and answer, and finally opportunity to purchase books and have book signing with Dr. Fujimura. And by the way, please turn off your cell phones and other things that go beep in the night. Tonight's speaker, Makoto Fujimura, or Mako as he has graciously allowed us to call him, is an artist, writer, and speaker who is recognized worldwide as a shaper of culture. He was born in the United States of Japanese descent and was raised partly in Japan, partly in the United States. As a doctoral student at the famed Tokyo University of Fine Art, he was one of two students. Every year, two doctoral students are accepted to study or really to become apprentices of the Nihonga style of traditional Japanese painting. This tradition goes back to the 11th century, and it's really a lineage program of study and almost an apprenticeship. And in his artistic career, he has combined Nihonga with Western abstract expressionism and color field painting. Fujimura's work has been displayed and is exhibited at galleries around the world in places like Tokyo and New York City and Hong Kong and Vienna. He's given many solo and joint exhibitions around the country and throughout the world. And he's often collaborated on projects with not only other painters, but with writers, poets, theologians, musicians, dancers, and others. In 1991, he founded the arts advocacy organization, International Arts Movement. For most of his artistic career, Mako has lived and worked in New York City with his wife Judy, and they have 3 children, now 23, 21, and 19 years old. On 9/11, Mako and his family were living just 3 blocks from the World Trade Center. And after the terrorist attacks, after around Thanksgiving, when they came back home, he opened his heart and his studio to many New York artists of various types of work who had lost their studios or maybe just lost their direction, lost their capacity to work. And the result was a whole series of artistic projects helping people to deal with the events of 9/11. From 2003 to 2009, Mako served as a presidential appointee to the National Council on the Arts. And since the tsunami in Japan in January of 2011, he has helped organize and continues to help organize artistic benefits for the rebuilding of the country. In addition to his extensive work as a painter, Mako is a writer and a speaker, speaking all over the country and world, and by my count has written or co-written 9 books, and we actually have 2 or 3 of them for sale tonight. You'll hear more about that later. He's done a lot of writing in publications such as Books and Culture, Image Journal, the New York Times, and many others. This is just a small sample of what Makoto Fujimura has done. But it's been a real privilege to get to know him in the last 24 hours. Just a wise and thoughtful and kind and faithful and passionate person. And when I try to communicate a little bit of that to you and what I know about his life and work, 3 images come to mind. The first is that he is a bridge. He's a bridge between the past and the present, between the East and the West, between visual arts and the written word and music and the other arts. He's a bridge between Christian faith and those of other faiths and philosophies. He's a bridge between people. We've found that already, the way he has connected people, not just to him, but to each other in the times that he's been on campus. Secondly, Mako is a caretaker. He takes care, or maybe I should say he's a caregiver. He gives care to the human soul, to the local community, to the world community, to human culture. And thirdly, I would call him a seer. You would expect that of a visual artist who helps us to see things that many of us would miss. But he doesn't just see what we would miss, he sees into the depth and into the meaning of things. And to my mind, he therefore stands in the line of those ancient Hebrews who were called seers, later called prophets. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Honorable Makoto Fujimura.
Well, thank you, Ed. What an introduction, and I'm going to speak knowing that whatever I say, unless there are people like yourself and the committee who hosted me so generously during my stay here, unless there are people locally who are doing the hard work, we cannot move forward in cultivating these values. And I so appreciate what you're doing in this community, in this conversation. It's a rich soil, and I'm going to be speaking a lot about that today. These are the materials that I use, materials for Nihonga, which is Japanese-style paintings. As I was introduced, I was a national scholar for 6.5 years to study, immerse myself in this technique, and apply what I learned to my contemporary works. You see malachite, azurite, pulverized minerals, gold, and different gradations of color that are hand mixed. Gold can be powder forms mixed with Nikawa glue or leaf that can be gilded right onto the paper. Brushes and paper and silk that are handmade, and it is really part of a collaborative way of working with people who make them in Japan, and many of them in the post-war generation who became master paper makers and brush makers are passing away now. And so part of my dialogue and conversation has always been about raising awareness of these indigenous forms of art, whether it be in Japan or elsewhere, that are critical for understanding culture at large, and being able to continue this conversation of tradition and the new. And so to me, one of the most important aspects of what I do is this negotiation between the past and perhaps the future, but also to say that culture, it needs to be cared for. Just as we have learned and is learning to take care of our environment and leave the earth intact for the next generation, we need to look at the ecosystem and culture in the same way. I'm going to show you a video which is being produced right now to be released actually next month by Plywood Pictures. And Plywood has been following me for the last 5 years, so they have a lot of film on me. But this is for the upcoming retrospective monograph called Golden Sea. And today, if you produce anything, you need a trader for it. So I asked them to produce this film and short documentary. But this is a very short trailer, kind of a glimpse into both the process of what I do and the technique. You see me working in the studio. And you also see a critic, Daniel Seidel, who is writing the major essay for this catalog monograph and who happens to be a graduate of this university. And you see several things. My barn in Princeton, which is my new studio. And also, you see me walking down the steps in Japan with my father in the background. My father is a really important influence in my life. He's a leading acoustics researcher in the world, worked at Bell Labs in the heydays of pure research at Bell Telephone Laboratories in Murray Hill, New Jersey. And then he was the head of linguistics acoustics research department at Ohio State. He's a remarkable person, and I'm creating an institute called Fujimura Institute, and I'm naming it after him because it is partly his journey and my brother, who is a Silicon Valley entrepreneur who bought my paintings early on to support me, who has really supported my journey. And so you see kind of a culmination of this in this video.
I think artists are deeply shaped by their particular location in the world. What I think a successful work does is that the artist brings everything they are to that work, but then that work itself has an integrity that really separates itself from the artist, kind of wedges the artist out. And so when the viewer experiences the work, the viewer isn't experiencing Mako. The viewer isn't experiencing Mako's ideas or thoughts. The viewer is experiencing this painting that happens to be infused with all of who Mako is.
So the painting in the background that you saw there is Golden Sea, which is the painting that will be on the cover of the monograph, and it's the key painting that will be presented at exhibits. It opens in New York, and this mini retrospective is being shown in other places, starting with Yale University next year. I told you about the barn. Here it is. Hardy the horse was living in it, but 8 months ago. I kicked him out. I felt bad about that, so I had a conversation with him and whether it would be okay to turn this into a studio. And he was okay with it, although I think he was more interested in the carrot that was inside my pocket and that conversation about art. But part of the reality of being an artist, and Dan is quite correct in saying that location and place has a lot to do with your intuitive side of your expression. And so, in a sense, moving to Princeton, New Jersey, in a farmhouse surrounded by natural preserves will affect my thinking and my work. To move to this space from here is quite a transition. And yet, I think when you think about culture at large and the effect of culture in individual lives and collective communities, we have to realize that the connection between a particular place, a location, geography, and the environment and culture at large is something very significant to our immediate experience. So whether living in ground zero or whether you're living in a farm with a converted barn now as a studio, it's connected. The city and the agrarian life of a farmer is connected intricately, and artists hover somewhere in between. And artists are always feeding and intuiting what is happening out there, no matter where he or she is. This was in the time, the cover, front page of New York Times. Anybody know what it is? Yeah, the oil spill, the BP oil spill. And the horrific images that we've seen. And this, too, is both horrific and, I think, somewhat beautiful and haunting. When I first saw this image, what it reminded me was this image that I studied in Tokyo. It's called Jigoku Zoshi, which means scrolls of hell. The fires of hell painted with Japanese vermilion. Magnificent painting. And yet, doesn't that remind us of the front page photo in New York Times? What is happening in culture today is linked to this reality of the environmental crisis that we face. That we don't really understand the complexity, both the complexity and reality of it, and yet we know that pollution has endangered much of what we would want for thriving lives. And if you think about culture at large, we can perhaps also make the case that pollution of culture has made things untenable, that right now as culture exists, we have gotten to a point where it is almost impossible to find a sustainable way that an artist can make a living. I'm an exception to that. And I realized very early on, when I founded the International Arts Movement, that my role as an artist, my responsibility goes beyond just succeeding as a painter. Because even if I succeeded, it really didn't mean anything in terms of larger culture. And the way you seek success is different for someone looking at this picture and being haunted by this decay of culture and seeing this image that constantly hovers somewhere in your consciousness, a brokenness. And so I have been thinking a lot about culture care, a term that my editor, Caleb Seating, came up with for me to work on several essays and perhaps a book. It seems to be growing into that. Culture care is simply to care for our culture as much as we have learned to care for our environment. It's a very simple concept. We have few people in the scientific community who has begun to speak of creation care. This integration of environmental stewardship with sciences and theology and so forth. Dr. Calvin DeWitt of Madison, Wisconsin, has been a leading voice in that charge. And he spoke at the International Arts Conference, the last conference that we had. And so I have basically stolen everything from Dr. DeWitt's writings and Wendell Berry's writings and applied simply to culture. And there's an immediate overlap between the two. To see culture at large as an ecosystem, to see all the influences of pollution that can really take away the beauty and thriving of the healthy ecosystem. Another influence is my wife, whose website is judycares.com. Little plug for her here. She's opening her practice in Princeton, and she does Skype. But living and journeying with her through the years in Japan as well as in New York, I have unconsciously learned and received from her therapeutic language. And so when I spoke about culture care to her, it was almost as if I was repeating back what she does in creating a healthy ecosystem in relationships. And that's what she does. So to me, just as I have stolen from Dr. Calvin DeWitt, I am stealing from my wife and borrowing her language to overlap with dealing with culture and thinking of these assumptions that we make in a very similar way, sometimes challenging the inherent assumptions, but also providing a larger picture toward a more healthy, more fully thriving reality that my wife always helps couples and families to move into. And culture care moves away, I think, from the ideologically driven culture wars language, and to raise empathy and compassion to the world. Now, I'm not saying that culture wars, the conversation is not necessary, or that in itself is something to avoid. There are convictions and passions that I'm sure we all have, and these voices are important, but the divisive language, the hijacking of ideological realities to shorter time span so that you can accomplish, all you accomplish really is to have this debate in the same old ideological territories is unproductive. I spent 6 years in Washington, and the most frustrating thing is that the deeper realities of our humanity is not expressed in those convictions that we hold. And so cultural care language, I think, is an attempt to provide another way of speaking across the divides, to communicate, maybe, about the deep convictions that we have. And so we turn to Atticus Finch, To Kill a Mockingbird, Harper Lee's great masterpiece. And Atticus Finch tells us, you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, Scout. Until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. I don't know how many of us were affected by this book. To understand that what Atticus Finch represents, what he says here, he's speaking to all of us, living in this divide of racial tension in the South. And for us to see and to receive this literature as a gift in our lives. And to hear Atkins's feeling, not only hear, but to identify with Scout, watching her father suffer for the ideals that he stands for, and to tell her gently, you have to be willing to climb into somebody else's skin and walk around in it. That's the power of art, I think. Literature, theater, poetry, dance, all these forms are ways that we can develop our empathetic capacities to be other-centered rather than self-centered. And the contemporary language, the diction of visual arts especially, has been hijacked, I think, by this narcissistic drive to self-expression only, without considering the effect of that to the larger culture. We can learn much from Atticus Finch as we can from T.S. Eliot, whose note toward the definition of culture is so important because culture is such a difficult word to define. And Eliot says here, if we take culture seriously, we see that a people does not need merely enough, sorry about that, that's a misspelling, merely enough to eat, but a proper particular cuisine. Culture may even be described simply as that which makes life worth living. Culture may even be described simply as that which makes life worth living. If you look at our culture today, the question is this: does our culture make our lives worth living? I struggle with this. Ever since I read this passage, I kept on asking myself, is it possible that we miss something in our modernistic, postmodern drive? To understand ourselves, to flatten our world in a sense. And Eliot is always speaking about the tradition and the individual expression, individual talent. That modernism has a tendency to skip out of this necessary obligation that we all have toward our past in order to create the future. And I think we might look at T.S. Eliot once again, what he has written, especially between the world wars, is so important to understand our culture today. And the voices like Ralph Ellison, too. If the word has the potency to revive and make us free, it has also the power to blind, imprison, and destroy. If the word has the potency to revive and make us free, it has also the power to blind, imprison, and destroy. So I kept on thinking, is it possible that in 20th century and now the beginning of 21st century, art has missed something? Has it been blind? Has it been imprisoned? Has it, instead of creating, have we destroyed? Have we lived in this darkness and despair, imprisoned, this no exit reality, and forgot this potency to revive and make us free? Have we been screaming against the sky because of the blindness, our condition of blindness to the larger picture, larger culture? when we should have been creating a condition where revived, fully thriving culture can be birthed, and can art be part of our effort to set us free, to liberate us from our bondage to decay, as St. Paul writes in Romans 8. And my conclusion has been, yes, we have. We have missed something and have decided to fragment and splinter all these elements into the world rather than trying to integrate them. So my father, the scientist, experienced at age of 65, he had to go back to his colleagues and said, you know, the assumptions that we have been making about labs in the 1970s, assumptions that we were so sure that it was correct, is wrong. And we have to start over. And he did not realize how threatening he would become to his colleagues. He could not receive the grants that he never had problems before. My brother had to pay for his graduate student at Ohio State so that he can complete his research to this alternative theory called converter distributor theory of acoustics. What is happening to our culture where a scientist cannot be a scientist, where an artist cannot be an artist? There's something wrong. And I had this conversation when I was at Tokyo National University, Tokyo University of the Arts, with a student who wanted to make it big in America, in New York. I was teaching this class of conversation English, and he took these classes because he was about to launch his career in New York City. Very gifted individual. I had no doubt that he would be successful. His name is Takashi Murakami. And you will know him if you know anything about contemporary art. His goal was to be the Andy Warhol of Japan. And he is the Andy Warhol of Japan today. His paintings are in every major museum. His photos, he was in Time magazine, 100 most influential people in the world last year. And his art is one of the floats at Macy's parades in New York City, and highly, highly successful. But with Takashi, I had this conversation, which has haunted me ever since. He was very clear of what he wanted to do with his career. And I had this opportunity to share with him some of my values, newfound values actually. I was a brand new Christian, and I wanted to share with him what I found. And so we had this deep conversation. He was very honest with me. Japanese rarely are honest with you. So they'll be nice, but they're not going to say what's on their mind. So I was actually very impressed because he rejected flatly this premise that I was presenting to him, these values that I have come to embrace. And then he said to me, if you follow that path, you will be rejected by the art world. And you will have to create your own market. And I said, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. He said, I am going to be the Andy Warhol of Japan. I'm going to play by the rules. This narcissistic, shock value as a commoditized, highly commoditized system of art. and he found his success. And yet what haunts me is not whether he succeeded or failed, or I succeeded or failed, but the reality behind what he said, the truth of what he said, is that the soil of culture today is not tenable. It's not sustainable. You have to make yourself into a monster in order to succeed. The soil of culture is not only tainted and polluted, it is radioactive. And you can put smiling faces on your work, but really what you're dealing with is death. Death of culture. Still tainted by Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The skulls that smile at you. And this is the world that Takashi has honestly depicted. And so when I think about what Eliot has spoken of and this situational analysis that we just went through in a very short discourse, obvious question to ask is, so what is the antidote? Is there a way out of this? And International Arts Movement is an effort to answer that question. And this book is a seminal, one of the most important books that you will read if you want to pursue the solution to the problem. The Gift, by poet Louis Hyde, written in the 80s, became an underground bestseller among artists in New York. And it still is so highly influential that people have dedicated their whole effort, their whole lives to the conversation that this book has generated. And his point is very simple. Art is a gift, not a commodity. Art is a gift, not a commodity. He quotes Joseph Conrad in the introduction to this book. The artist appeals to that part of our being, which is a gift and not an acquisition, and therefore more permanently enduring. Louis Hyde makes his point by referring to what happened to the salmon fishery in the Pacific Northwest. When the Native Americans managed the waters, they took the salmon as a gift from nature, from the gods, and they managed it with respect, not to take more than what they need, and they, even in a sense, return the gift back to the waters. I love this image by this Northwest native artist, Tony Hunt. The fish is full of life. The inside is pregnant with potential. And when the Western forces, of course, came in and took over the waters and commoditized the salmon, of course, the salmon population went way down, and it's still struggling to recover. Louis Hyde makes a point. That same thing is happening to the artists. Art, which is principally a gift, is turned into a commoditized frenzy. Artists cannot survive in that environment. Very few can. And I think he is right. Think about, if you are an artist, why you are an artist. For most of us, it begins very early. It's that moment something happens when we are painting or we are playing the piano or we wrote something, and we realized part of ourselves, part of our being, become embedded in this thing that you created. There's magic to this. And this communication that happens between what has been given to you and what you're pouring into this is this deeper, intuitive layers of love that you have tapped into. And that first love is so intoxicating that you can't get rid of it. It doesn't matter if in middle school people tell you cannot be an artist. There's no way that you can make a living at it. It doesn't matter if the gray, pragmatic world constantly hammers away at the idealism of what you're doing. You just cannot stop. You just know that there is a reality that you must serve. And so you write 3 a.m. in the morning so you can wake up and start baking and take care of your mother who is ill. You write without no one knowing that you are writing poetry. Emily Dickinson's homestead in Amherst, if you visit, you can see this desk, a cherrywood desk, 17.5 inches by 17.5 inch desk. That's all she had. But she didn't put anything else on it other than her poems. And I tell young artists all the time, that's all you need. But you have to dedicate yourself to that space. Do not let anything else go on that table. Let your drawing, let your being remain on that space. And so you can always have a place to go home to. You can always be inspired to write the last paragraph, the last stanza of a poem, even though you're coming back 2 a.m. in the morning and you are vice president of General Foods. You're exhausted. You have to get up at 5:30 in the morning to go back to work. You still write, as Dana Joyer, your former chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, did for many years. No one knew he was a poet until he started to get published and win awards. Emily Dickinson, amazing woman. I was recently at a place called Poet's House, right near Ground Zero in New York City. And they had Emily Dickinson exhibit there. And they were exhibiting her letters that she had written to many of her friends, to her editor, so forth, in Boston. And, but they were also exhibiting at the same time her recipes. The letters were written in this formal script. Beautiful writing. I wish I could write like that. But the recipes were more informal. It was playful. It had all sorts of funny things to it. And she was just quickly writing it down for her friends so she can share her recipe as a gift. And she would often write her poems in the back of the recipe. You know what I noticed? Her handwriting was not formal. The handwriting that she used for her poems were the same as she used for her recipes. They were her recipes for life. They were necessary. They were immediate. They were something to be shared as a gift to her friends. Apparently not many people kept these recipes or her poems. They appreciated the flowers from her garden. This is the replica at the New York Botanical Garden 2 years ago. That she would bring to people who were ill or pass it to her sister Lavinia so she can give it to them. She was very shy, probably had a mild form of epilepsy, so she didn't want to embarrass herself in front of the public. Her father was a House of Representative member from Amherst. So she stayed home, took care of her garden with her Irish gardeners, and created this magnificent soil garden that was famous in Amherst. But no one knew that it was Emily who was taking care of it. And they were her recipes, her poems were her recipes, and very few people knew that she was writing these poems. She sent one to an editor in Boston. He approved them for publishing. But when she found out that he had edited out her half rhymes into full rhymes, he had changed them. And all of the punctuations and dashes were removed. She never published again. Emily Dickinson wrote her poems as a gift to the world. But it was a gift that she didn't even know would be received. When she was passing, she decided to put all of her important poems in a little box, stitch them in what's now called as fascicles, put them in the box, and put the box under her bed without telling anybody. Her sister Lavinia, who knew she wrote poems, discovered the box about 2 months after she passed away, Emily passed away, was astounded to find nearly 1,000 poems neatly bound, and the layers and layers of thought that she has accumulated over the years. And when I heard about this, I knew what she was doing. See, she was a gardener. She understood about soil. She knew that a good bulb sometimes takes years before they can take root. She knew that the soil conditions, if they were not right, if the winter is coming, that good seed will wait until the right condition. And she certainly knew the cultural soil of her time was not ready for her poems. So she buried her poems, just as a good gardener would do, into the soil which she trusted with faith that will come up again, will blossom when the time is right. The reason why I'm convinced that she knew that it would be read is evidenced in her writings. She wrote as if she was writing to us today. And her poems are so potent when you understand that she was writing these poems as a gift to us today. Christian Wyman, the poet, said this: "We live and by our senses, which are conditioned in and by our death." As I am learning to garden in my garden in Princeton, I've learned much about the soil. You know what a soil really is? It's like I was so amazed when I realized this for the first time. It's layers and layers of dead things. It's vegetables and hay and maybe animals and insects, who knows what. It's all layers and layers of death. composted and decomposed and into the layers of death, a seed is planted, right? And a good farmer knows that it takes time for the soil conditions to ripen, to become right. So she is patient, waiting for the right time to arrive. So a poet is like a good gardener, knowing that our senses are conditioned to receive, that we live in and by them. But that conditioning can only be done if we understand that we live in layers and layers of our own death experiences. And so when I think about culture at large, I think about that. Because culture, too, is layers and layers of dead things. If you walk into a museum, you're looking at dead objects, basically. Accumulations of years and years of life and death. But if you know, like Emily Dickinson did, that though it seems bleak, though the reality of culture as pronounced by Takashi Murakami and as we sense today, this highly polluted, over-commoditized frenzy that we call culture, though things seem bleak, but the reality of the layers of cultural condition may yet be necessary. This accumulation of decomposed dead things may actually be necessary for us. And as Emily believed, I think in order for renewal of culture, for these seeds that artists and poets and dancers and actors plant into the soil conditions, in order for them to take deeper root, we have to prepare the soil. That's our work. We have to be diligent. We have to do the hard work of tilling when things are bleak and winter time is coming. I love Wendell Berry, as I mentioned, and he is truly the prophet of our time. He writes this: the difficulty, but also the wonder of the story of the Promised Land is that there, the primordial and still continuing dark story of human rapaciousness begins to be accompanied by a vein of light, which, however improbably and uncertainly, still accompanies us. This light originates in the idea of the land as a gift. Not as free or deserved gift, but a gift given upon certain rigorous condition. There's work to be done to understand this rigorous condition, but to remember that as land is a gift, culture is a gift. This is my painting called Golden Sea. It's hard to see, but all my paintings are almost impossible to reproduce. But it's a work that I didn't have any purpose for. I was just simply working on this for about 2.5 years while I was working on other projects, most importantly, the project for Four Holy Gospels, which took 1.5 years to accomplish. I needed something to work on, and I tell young artists this all the time: always, always do work that is not for the market system. Do work that is not for an exhibit, do work that is not going to be published, to keep that first love alive in you. Do something just for the sake of doing it, just because you love to act. Let it be a gift to the world. So I was working on this piece for 2 years, maybe 2.5 years. And my son Tai comes in, who took many of the photographs and who was doing a video for Holy Gospels, came into the studio and he saw this painting and he said, "Dad, what is this painting?" I said, "I don't know. I just been working on it." I said, "Dad, this is amazing. This is an amazing painting. It actually captures everything you've done." I was like, "Wow, I think you're right." After a while, I was kind of shocked that he said that, because I wasn't really thinking much about it. And then I realized how right he was. And when my gallery owner and I went through the images for this retrospective monograph, she said, this has to be the main painting. And I was really amazed that this conversation, finally, you were thinking about art as a gift and not painting for the sake of anything, unconsciously hovering above it, as it were, allows this full intuitive reality to come through. And I think you find that in every sphere of the arts. If you are interested in further dialoguing about this, to push this further, please check out the internationalartsmovement.org, a website that we have been designing so anyone, whether you're an artist or not, can participate in this work of culture care. If you are interested in resources, if you're interested in ways that you can start a simple conversation among your friends, or how to do a Wednesday morning group, discussion group, with all the materials there for you to use. There are culture magazines that we're doing through only on the website, but it's called Curator Magazine, which instead of critiquing and complaining about culture, we decided, why don't we write what we find beautiful and good and true in culture? So you find these essays, short essays written by various artists and writers from all over the world, actually now. They are coalesced in this effort called Curator Magazine. It's all linked into this site. So, and as part of International Arts Movement, as I said, I've started this institute, small institute called Fujimura Institute, which is to bring into this collaboration and cooperation and to inspire all of us to piece together a whole view of the world, to defy this fractured, fragmented modern perspectives. We will be doing several projects accompanying this. I am, and Fujimura Institute is organizing what's known as four quartets projects, starting at Baylor University, and in December of this year, we'll travel to Duke, Yale, Gordon, and ultimately to Cambridge and universities in Japan and China. So you can find out all of this through our website, through International Arts Movement and Fujimura Institute. I want to end with Emily Dickinson poem, audaciously placed next to my painting. I hope that's okay with Emily. My wife thinks I'm having an affair with her. She's a psychotherapist, so we have to be honest here. But notice the forced readings, the dashes, the hyphens that her editor removed. I'm convinced that the liminal space between heaven and earth, that these hyphens represent link between words, bridges between ideas and images. Emily saw herself in these dashes. She writes, those not live yet, who doubt to live again. Again is of a twice, but this is one. The ship beneath the draw aground is he. Death, so the hyphen of the sea. Deep is the schedule of the disk to be. Costumeless consciousness, that is he. Those not alive yet, that's us. Who doubt to live again, maybe that's us living in the despair of today's cultural condition, certainly in Japan. That's true. Again is of a twice, but this is one. The integration. The ship beneath the draw aground is he. The Connecticut River runs up to Amherst, and many ships, even though the bridge is raised, cannot get through because the tidal waves have gone and they have to wait until it comes back. Patience, waiting for the right condition to appear so you can move on. Death, so the hyphen of the sea. The reality of what death is, as we talked about, this accumulation, layers and layers of things that we rather much avoid. No, it's a hyphen. It's necessary for her, because deep is the schedule of the disk to be not schedule, but schedule, because it needs to rhyme with costumeless consciousness. That is he. Who is that she's talking about? Who is this he? Don't answer that. Let it be your meditation today, this week. Think about what the poets are writing, artists are painting, the space between dancers. Atticus Finch, Ralph Edison. Thank you.
I'd like to open it up for questions, comments, reflections. Please keep them brief and to the point.
One thought that came to my mind as you were talking is that one of the comments that I hear so often is, it's to die for, when it usually means like an iPhone or something that's on sale on Thanksgiving, the night after, or the morning after Thanksgiving, versus to create the soil from which something alive can come. And I was just wondering if you could comment more on that idea.
Well, that language is very important, isn't it? I mean, we live and swim in between the words. And you're right, many times we use words very carelessly, and I'm sure I do it too. But we live in a very a very gray world, as I said, dominated by utilitarian pragmatism, where the liminal spaces, the dashes and hyphens are eliminated from our lives. And what we value are things that we can buy, and we can say, I have it, I possess it, I'm consuming it, rather than living life in a way that everything that we do can be a gift to be given away generously into the world. And that's the world that I think artists have lived. Like Emily Dickinson, she has completely allowed herself to live in that zone, and therefore her words are golden to us. They are the antidote to this consumer mentality, where everything is measured by profit margins, and even greed is accepted as a way that we advance in culture. And she is the antidote. The very effort that we make to till the soil, to garden, to think of ways to do slow art, to slow down, to pay attention, to be aware of what we are doing, that cannot be bought or sold or marketed or given to anyone as consumption, but it is what makes us human, I think, and therefore artists are necessary for the world. Today we live in a time when you can go through the entire public school system, through K to 12, without having any art at all, or music. That's the first thing that gets cut, right?
So you feel like
how you doing?
Good.
So you just feel like your lecture just really you just comparing culture just already to like talent and love and passion. Do you like feel like it's a connection to also like belief? Like, like this past week, the U.S. has been under turmoil with, the Muslim faith. Yeah. So that's kind of disrespect to culture, and that's kind of what you're talking about. But it seems like you're just talking about just for the love of doing a passion. So what's like, is it both, or is it singular, or is it?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above. Frankly, I think about Atticus Finch, what he's talking about there. Do we really step into another person's, reality? Are we willing to sacrifice our position to do that? And I don't think we're doing that. So whether it be Muslims or North Koreans or, Japanese and Chinese or even our neighbors, right? It is about love. It is about the failure of our part to be able to love with this full abandon, to live as if that was the only thing that mattered. And we don't do that. And so our society is made up of conversations where you are almost putting back from the original intent of your humanity, and the market system kind of twists that into this way of creating desire, where there's where this love desire gets twisted into consumption. So we're always fighting against that. And the media, the media does not mediate. Media is setting things. It's the most highly commoditized system there is. So their language is always truncated to this disfigurement of even the best of ideologies. So you cannot have a conversation in the media world today. We need journalists who fight against us, who swim against the current and say, no, I'm going to write the whole story, not this story that sells. We need TV producers who capture the whole story, the fullness of humanity, rather than just getting the chunk so that you can get that, airspace, airtime. And it's just, we swim in this, so we get so used to it. But the artists around us are the ones that are pointing out, transgressing against that system. And I always tell artists, if you need to transgress, do it, but transgress in love. Think of the whole, not just your self-expression, but care for culture. And you will gain so much more in doing that. Far more than you would even if you were to find the greatest success as an artist, as a dancer, as a singer. What happened to Whitney Houston? This young girl, right, at the age of 19, she steps in front of Grammy Award at, I think it was in '84 or something. Amazing gift, operatic voice. And at the end of her life, she was but a shell of herself. What happened to that? I was having this conversation with a photographer in LA, and she takes wedding photos. And she was saying, how people say you take photos? She said, I come to believe that you actually do take people's souls when you take photos. So I thought about that, and I said, you're right, I think so too. So how about if we find a way to gift photos? We have to find a word for this, How do you give away to affirm people as you gift photos? What kind of a wedding photographer will you be if you can give away your gift? I think you'll take amazing photos if you can do that. But see, those things you kind of have to start thinking about deeply and wrestling with constantly with friends and peers, and challenge each other to push yourself, beyond the status quo. Unfortunately, because the world is, kind of pushing against that. So, thank you.
I should begin by thanking you for your talk, because I'm about to ask you an extremely academic-y question. So I want to start by saying I thought it was fantastic. I was actually kind of blown away by the conversation with Murakami Takashi that you mentioned. And especially since the whole super flat movement that he's associated with is often described as a kind of flirtation with nihilism. And I guess the reason why I was blown away by your entire talk is because you actually seem to be saying the exact opposite about his point of view, is that it's not a flirtation with nihilism. It's actually an attempt to create certainty, a kind of cynical certainty. And that a true flirtation with nihilism is actually one like your amazing reading of Emily Dickinson. And I have to say, as a poet and as a scholar of poetry, it's perfectly okay. You have my imprimatur to put those two next to each other. If only for, you could be a shit painter, but for the talk alone, it was worth it. So I just wanted to hear you comment on what you think a meaningful engagement with uncertainty and with death is, and if that is a way to actually think about this entire concept of care for culture that you're trying to elaborate on here.
Yeah, thank you for that. I have such an enormous respect for Takashi that I am completely biased. Okay, we did talk about that when he was a graduate student. He understood that the path that he was taking was to, in the same ways that others have done in contemporary art world, is to, in a way, destroy, to annihilate. And he knew that he would be doing that, and superflat certainly is a concept that flows out of Japanese art completely, and yet he has modified it or maybe transfigured it to our times. It's absolutely brilliant. He's a brilliant artist. And so what he has done, I have no objections with, because he's being absolutely honest about the cultural realities, and he's able to capture them in the most astute and beautiful ways. His color sense is impeccable. And I know that because I've seen him as a student, and not just because he's a commoditized machine that he is today. But to his credit, too, he's now kind of moving away from his success and, paying attention to indigenous cultures of Japan. He's promoting this potter that's living in northern Japan now, and doing all these efforts to give attention to indigenous Japanese culture and craft. And so while he is rather transgressive in what he talks about the system of art itself and Nihonga world and his disdain for the system, I think he's reaching into something that is much more communal than what the theory would suggest, especially early on when he was writing about superflat. I think I have a feeling, and I wish I can have a conversation with him today, the same level of conversation that I had back then. Maybe I would have an opportunity, since I'm a very good friend with his brother, who was my studio mate. So, there's this ongoing conversation that needs to happen about that, and certainly I think your analysis is quite right. The language that there is very much, that's the tension that I love about his work. Yeah.
Mako, let me ask a question. You alluded briefly to, as a student, coming to the Christian faith, and from what I've read and heard you speak before, it's almost a kind of recognition. Yeah. Could you just tell us a little bit more about that?
I was saying that, I always believed in God. You have to, in order to create. I knew it was not my thing. It was not just my gift or my power. It was something flowing through me when I felt that magic. I didn't know what to call it. I searched for, I studied Zen, Buddhism, and I searched through different traditions and different systems to understand that. But when I came to understand what Christ meant to bridge this divide, this gap, this fragmentation that I was experiencing, this brokenness that I knew that was within. That I was creating beauty, but I didn't have a place in my heart for beauty. Because to be honest, and this is what I shared with Takashi, is that I don't, in myself, I'm broken, and I don't have a shelf to put that beauty upon. So I needed to find a paradigm in which, if there was a paradigm, that I could actually pursue beauty wholeheartedly. And of course he would reject that and say, well, no, but cynicism is the only path. At that point, I was fairly convinced that my path will be one of moving toward beauty and toward this space of integration. So, we went this kind of this opposite way, and found our voices, I guess, in these two different systems. But I still think that that reality of cultural soil condition being radioactive and tainted is true for both of us. It's not something that just because I follow Christ, it doesn't mean that I have found the right soil condition. So, yeah.
Hi, I have a question. So you mentioned that, I'm wondering, how did you overcome the radioactive soil condition? Because you mentioned your brother bought many of your earlier paintings, but what else that allowed you to push on? And
I don't know if I've been able to. I'm still haunted by it, and I will continue to be. I think though I know the direction that I want to go. If I want a beautiful garden, I better start tilling the soil. And even though it may not be perfect, and I have to do what I can do. But one solution is international arts movement. We are trying to create this microcosm in which the conversation is different. You enter that space, and what you have thought about or dreamed about is affirmed, is talked about as a potential beginning, rather than in New York where everything, is basically discarded as something that cannot be done, something. Well, that's not just in New York, but everywhere, where these ideas and visions are taken seriously. And I want to create a climate in which these conversations can take place and have an opportunity to be, sown into a soil condition that, so you can have this deeper wrestling of art, faith, and humanity. And so, I think it's a very small effort and limited, but the stories that we hear, and you can go to our website, and we'll be posting some of these stories, are pretty remarkable. People like CEOs of banks listening into a conversation between two artists and realizing that he needs to go to his board and ask, is our bank rehumanizing our culture, or is it dehumanizing our culture? And the answer that he got from his board and his employees, they started this kind of a place where employees can just give a little bit each month, and they had people assigned to use them at their discretion to help the community. So this mother with 3 kids in the back seat came into the bank teller, and it was a drive-through, and the car broke down. And the mother is weeping, and the bank employee goes to her and, can I help you? And she says, my car broke down. What am I going to do now? And he goes back to his manager and says, can we use this fund? And he says yes. So he goes back out, pushes the car with 3 other employees, and tells her, we'll take care of this. That's amazing. That's beautiful. And if that can happen in a bank, because this bank CEO heard a conversation between 2 artists, it can probably happen anywhere.
Thank you very much for your presentation. you spoke briefly of the culture wars, and some of those came out of some that were reevaluating both the Christian culture and the American culture. And a new thing that I'm beginning to hear is discussion of creating culture in the Christian community. And could you speak to whether there's overlap or distinction between what you're talking about in terms of culture care versus creating care?
Right. I know Andy Crouch, and we wrote the book Culture Mix. I know James Davison Hunter. We were good friends. So these terms are being defined now are really something that I have seen in a conversation for a long time, and I'm grateful for that. As far as making culture, it's a hard thing to judge because I don't know, how much is possible to understand. T.S. Eliot writes about this, that culture it's a very nebulous term, and it's very hard to point at something and say, well, here's a culture that is being created, because an artist painting is not necessarily doing that to create culture. I mean, you might interpret that in a very localized sense, but is it affecting the larger culture? I don't know. So I think we have to kind of be careful how we go about that business of making culture, but we can certainly till the soil. I think that's the whole point, is that I think in some ways there's a generative potential in every person, every situation, every form of art, and unless it's released in the right cultural conditions, that it will simply not take root, and it's not going to affect, the ecosystem at large. So that's what I have been focusing on. Of course, I am making culture by creating paintings, perhaps, but I think, anyways, the proactive stance is good. Rather than having these divisive ideological battles, if we both focused on creating something good for our communities, maybe we'll accomplish a lot more in the long term. It would take certainly sacrifice on everybody's part. Culture care is everybody's work, and it's very simple. It's like picking up a can and throwing it away. It's really turning our minds from being consumers of culture to being creators, and doing that in love, doing that in caring for our world. And so I hope that it's part of making culture.
Again, thank you very much for coming. And again, thank you very much for this gift, Makoto Fujimura.
You're watching City Channel 4. On TV, online, on demand, on Facebook, and now on the go on your mobile device.